Imagine you could move away from Earth, that you rise kilometer by kilometer until the continents become abstract shapes and the oceans lose their color. From up there, the whole world fits in a single glance. Armies which from the ground look like chaotic masses of flesh and steel become arrows moving across maps. Naval battles are constellations of points that disappear beneath the water. Burning cities light up the darkness as if they were stars, level with the ground. That is what this documentary offers you. Between 1939 and 1945, 78 million people died. 67 out of every 100 were civilians. The greatest conflict in the history of humanity did not begin or end in a single trench, nor in a single ocean, nor on a single continent. It was fought simultaneously in the Arctic and in the desert, in the Pacific and on the Russian steppes, in the skies of Europe and inside secret laboratories scattered across 3 countries. No commander could see it all. No general had the complete picture. But from space, the picture is there. This is World War II as you have never seen it before. The Sleeping Giant, Pearl Harbor, and the Awakening of the United States. At 7:55 in the morning on December 7, 1941, peace ended. The German army had been at war for 27 months. It had already left 6.5 million casualties in its wake. The Wehrmacht was stationed at the gates of Moscow. Great Britain hung by a thread. But 4,800 kilometers from Europe, the United States slept. 76% of its citizens supported neutrality. It was a nation watching the disaster of others from a comfortable distance, convinced that the oceans were sufficient walls. That conviction took exactly 270 seconds to shatter. 360 Japanese planes descended on Pearl Harbor. The American Pacific Fleet, anchored in formation on the island of Oahu, Hawaii, was the target. The attack was not an impulse. It was the result of months of meticulous planning, of war games simulated over and over, of pilots who had already spent years fighting in China and Manchuria and who arrived at the Hawaiian theater with combat experience that their adversaries simply did not have. From space, the trajectory of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's Japanese fleet says it all. The naval formation departed from northern Japan, skirting the usual sea routes, deliberately avoiding land masses and merchant traffic lines. It arrived 442 kilometers from the target, just outside the range of American defensive radar, but within the optimal flight range of its 414 aircraft. The launch point was not chosen at random. It was calculated with surgical precision. The technological jewel of the Japanese Air Force was the Mitsubishi A6M, known among Allied pilots by the codename Zero. Faster than any plane the Americans had used until then, extraordinarily maneuverable, with a flight range that left Western engineers stunned. But what mattered on that December dawn was not the machine. It was the man inside it. The Japanese pilots had been at war since 1937. They had seen real combat. They had learned to kill in the skies over Shanghai and Nanking. At 7:55, the first wave came down from the sky. On the deck of the USS Arizona, a sailor who would survive to testify decades later recalled knowing immediately that something was radically wrong. The planes were descending too low, too fast, and they were not American. In 68 minutes, the heart of the Pacific Fleet was mutilated. The USS Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, and the California were sunk. The rest were severely damaged. The Japanese lost 64 men. American casualties rose to 3,649, a human damage ratio of 57-1. From the Japanese perspective, the attack exceeded even the most optimistic expectations, but it concealed 2 flaws that would change the course of the war. The Japanese did not attack the fuel depots at Pearl Harbor. Millions of liters of naval fuel stored a few kilometers from the point of impact were left intact. If those tanks had burned, the operational capacity of the American Navy in the Pacific would have been paralyzed for months. But the second flaw was even more serious. The American aircraft carriers were not in port when the attack arrived. The USS Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga were on other missions. And with the evolution of the war that was to come, that absence proved to be providential. The aircraft carrier, and not the battleship, would become the decisive naval asset of World War II. Yamamoto knew it. He said it. And even so, the 3 aircraft carriers that would have determined the outcome of his operation escaped without a scratch. But Prime Minister Hideki Tojo had calculated something different. Japan could never compete with the United States in a long war. Its oil reserves were limited, its industrial capacity inferior. The only option was to strike a blow so devastating that the American response would arrive too late. A blow that would buy enough time to build a defensive perimeter so vast, so fragmented into islands scattered across thousands of kilometers of ocean that no army would want to pay the price of dismantling it. The plan worked for exactly 6 months. Pearl Harbor did what no diplomatic action, no speech by Churchill, no photograph of bombed cities in Europe had achieved. It unified the American population behind the war. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was no longer limited in his options. The 76% that supported neutrality evaporated overnight. Isolationism, that doctrine that had kept America on the margins of the world for decades, died at Pearl Harbor, with the 3,649 men who lay at the bottom of the harbor. 4 days after the attack, Nazi Germany declared war on the United States. Hitler, convinced of Japanese invincibility in the Pacific and that the American giant would take years to rearm, made the most catastrophic decision of his military career. In a single move, Roosevelt went from having a problem to having a global war, and he began to calculate how to win it. The price of staying standing, the Battle of the Atlantic. Washington calculated that victory would cost $300 billion. In today's money, that equals more than 4.4 trillion, more than 1.5 times the total federal budget of the United States in 1941. Half could be financed through taxes. For the rest, the government would turn to the public. Raising $150 billion from private citizens in wartime was, in the words of one of the architects of the campaign, a challenge that seemed insurmountable. The solution was Hollywood. More than 300 actors, singers, and film figures joined the campaign christened Stars Over America and toured the country from coast to coast. In Chicago, 2 massive celebrity gatherings raised more than $15 million in war bonds in a single afternoon. In New York, a triple baseball game generated $56 million. By the end of the conflict, the bond campaigns had raised $187.5 billion. But the money was useless if it did not reach where it was needed. And the problem was that the path was blocked. Great Britain had been fighting alone for 17 months. After the evacuation of Dunkirk in June 1940 and the fall of France, it was the only democratic power still standing in Western Europe. Its survival depended on one thing: keeping the supply routes across the Atlantic open. It imported 5 million tons of materials every month: food, fuel, steel, munitions. Without those ships, Great Britain would cease to exist as a fighting power within weeks. German Admiral Karl Dönitz knew it. His calculation was brutal in its simplicity. If he managed to sink 1 million tons of Allied cargo per month, Great Britain would be on its knees within 5 months. The weapon he had to achieve it was the U-boot, the German submarine, capable of traveling thousands of kilometers submerged, equipped with torpedoes, mines, and deck guns, and practically invisible to the detection technologies available in 1940. When a torpedo hit beneath a merchant ship's keel, the detonation created a vacuum that made the hull collapse from below. The sailors who survived described it in different ways. All agreed on one thing: it was deadly before you could react. But Dönitz went further than the individual U-boot. He invented the Rudel tactic, the wolf pack. Instead of each submarine operating independently, the U-boot deployed in long patrol lines and used radio signals to converge en masse on a convoy. When they detected an Allied formation, they called in every boat available. You could lose half your convoy before the night was over. In 12 months, 900 Allied ships were sunk. Only 29 U-boot were destroyed. Winston Churchill had understood from the beginning that Great Britain could not win alone. The first victory it needed was not on land or in the air. It was in the Atlantic. Roosevelt, officially neutral, made a deal. 50 American destroyers in exchange for 8 British bases abroad and the dismantling of the preferential trade treaty with the colonies of the Empire. It was a painful deal for Churchill. It meant the beginning of the end of the British Empire. But it was the price of staying standing. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the situation worsened before it improved. The Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, responded to the American declaration of war by launching Operation Drumbeat, a U-boot attack directly along the east coast of the United States. Merchant ships sank in sight of the beaches of Florida, illuminated by the lit-up signs of hotels that no one had turned off. By mid-1942, 2,700 Allied ships had been sunk. The rate was 36 U-boot destroyed per Allied ship lost, an unsustainable hemorrhage. The turning point came from where it was least expected. 15 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, on September 1, 1940, the scientist Henry Tizard, head of the British Aeronautical Research Committee, arrived in Washington with a briefcase. Or, more precisely, with a trunk. Inside were all the technological secrets that Great Britain possessed, handed over in exchange for access to American industrial production lines. An American official described that box as the most valuable cargo ever to reach the shores of this country. The content was extraordinary: feasibility studies for an atomic bomb, jet engine designs, rockets, superchargers, gyroscopic sights, submarine detectors, plastic explosives, and one piece of technology that would change the war on its own. Cavity magnetron number 12, a radar component so advanced it was 1,000 times more effective than any American equivalent. It could be mounted on a plane or a ship. It could detect a U-boot periscope from kilometers away, even at night, even in the rain. American assembly lines began mass-producing it. The second factor was encryption. Since June 1939, the Combat Intelligence Unit of the United States Navy, under the command of Commander Joseph John Rochefort, well, technically under the command of several officers at different times, but it was Rochefort's team in Hawaii that would make the most critical contribution. In the Atlantic, however, it was the British cryptologists of Bletchley Park who ultimately broke the German Enigma code, which Dönitz used to coordinate the movements of his wolf packs. When the intelligence arrived and the magnetron was in the air, the mid-Atlantic gap, that strip of ocean that Allied aircraft could not reach from any land base, began to close. By April 1943, 3,450 Allied ships had been lost since the start of the war. But new escort carriers, loaded with long-range aircraft equipped with the magnetron, began to patrol that dark zone. The decisive battle was Convoy ONS-5 in May 1943. 42 vessels set sail from Liverpool bound for Canada. Dönitz identified them as a perfect target and launched his packs with growing urgency because he knew he needed to sink more and more tonnage. The first wave of U-boat sank 13 Allied ships. But when the fog fell, the advantage reversed. Armed with the decrypted German codes and state-of-the-art radar, the Allied anti-submarine forces counter-attacked without pause. The U-boats were destroyed one after another. Dönitz withdrew his packs and said something he rarely said in the whole war, that he had seen what the Allies had come to be, that the Battle of the Atlantic was over. He had lost 41 U-boats in May 1943 alone. His most lethal instrument had been neutralized, and with it the last hope of strangling Great Britain before the American war machine reached its full power. The production miracle, the industrial transformation of the United States. There is an image that historians repeat to describe what happened in the United States between 1942 and 1945. Someone took the North American continent by the East Coast, lifted it, tilted it, and everything, the people, the money, the machines, slid toward the West. The population of California increased 53% during the war, Oregon 40%, Washington 37%. But the phenomenon was not only geographic, it was social, industrial, demographic. 19 million women joined the workforce, working in armament factories, in transportation, in agriculture. Typewriter manufacturers began producing rifle components. Those who made refrigerators converted their lines to manufacture armored vehicles. The automobile plants in Detroit switched to producing bombers. The speed of the change was so brutal that the engineers themselves found it hard to believe. The War Industries Committee divided the country into specialized production zones and coordinated the reconversion with an efficiency that the Axis countries could never match. And the result at the end of 6 years of war was a list that seemed impossible. 87,000 ships and landing craft, 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 300,000 aircraft, 2 million trucks, 20 million rifles and light weapons, 41 billion units of ammunition, enough to kill the world's population 17 times over. That last figure is not a metaphor. It is a real number, produced by an economy that in 1939 was still recovering from the Great Depression. The financing came from the bond campaigns, from war taxes, and from a fiscal discipline that few modern democratic governments could have imposed. But behind all of that was something more fundamental: the ability of American society to mobilize behind a single objective with a speed that its enemies had not calculated. Hitler had assumed that the United States would take years to convert its industrial potential into real military power. It took months. The problem was the following: all that steel, all that ammunition, all those planes needed to reach the battlefront, and Roosevelt's decision about which front to attack first would determine the entire course of the war. Germany first, the strategy that decided everything. When the United States entered the war, its assets in the Pacific were at the mercy of a Japan advancing at a speed that left analysts stunned. In 6 months, the Japanese had taken almost complete control of the Pacific theater: Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. American, British, and Dutch territories fell one after another. The Japanese offensive had a clear logic, seen from space. The resources of the East Indies, Indonesian oil, Malayan rubber, were what the empire needed to sustain its war machine, and the captured islands built a defensive perimeter that would make any American response cost time, blood, and steel in quantities that Tokyo calculated Washington would never be willing to pay. But Roosevelt made the most counterintuitive decision of the war: Germany first. The reasoning was this: if Great Britain fell under Nazi domination, the problem of recovering the Pacific became almost unsolvable. Without Great Britain as a base, without its ports, without its airfields, without its intelligence network built over years of combat, an invasion of the European continent was impossible. Great Britain was, in Roosevelt's own words, a great aircraft carrier that would allow the invasion of the continent. Losing it meant starting from zero thousands of kilometers from Europe with the Atlantic controlled by Dönitz's U-boot. And there was something more. Germany, with its industrial base in the Ruhr, with its scientists working on rocket technologies and potentially on nuclear weapons, represented a long-term threat of a different category than Japan's. Roosevelt saw it before almost anyone else in his cabinet. The Germany First strategy meant that the main effort of American military potential would be concentrated in the European theater, with the Pacific receiving whatever resources remained. For the commanders fighting in the Pacific, that was a permanent source of frustration. But the decision proved to be correct. To implement it, Roosevelt needed the Soviet Union to hold out on the Eastern Front. Every German division that Stalin kept occupied on the Russian steppes was a division that did not reach Normandy. The problem was getting supplies to Moscow in quantities sufficient to sustain that effort. There were 3 routes, and each had its problems. The North Atlantic route, passing through Archangel and Murmansk, crossed turbulent, frozen Arctic seas, patrolled by the same U-boot that threatened the Atlantic convoys. The Pacific route reached as far as Vladivostok, but everything then had to be loaded onto the Trans-Siberian Railway and travel thousands of kilometers to the fronts, which took weeks. The third option, skirting the Cape of Good Hope and entering through the Persian Gulf toward Iran, was the longest but proved to be the most viable. Building that route was, in itself, a feat. There was no infrastructure. The docks did not exist. The Allied engineers built them from scratch, while at the same time laying 720 kilometers of new roads and modernizing 3,200 kilometers of railway lines. With the routes open, the United States pumped 16.5 million tons of supplies toward Russia: gasoline, ammunition, a complete military telecommunications system, 14 million pairs of boots, enough food to guarantee every Soviet soldier a daily ration for more than a year, and what turned out to be the most critical contribution on the battlefield: 500,000 Studebaker trucks manufactured in Detroit. The Studebaker truck changed the war on the Eastern Front in a way rarely acknowledged in Western history books. The Red Army had artillery in massive quantities, but immobile. When anti-tank artillery was mounted on Studebaker trucks, it became a rapid reaction force capable of moving across the entire battlefield. The Germans, who had calculated they would face a static and heavy enemy, found themselves facing something different. The sky over Europe, the Bomber War. September 1939. The squadrons of the German Luftwaffe brought Poland, the Netherlands, and France to their knees in weeks. The speed and coordination of air attacks combined with armored forces, the Blitzkrieg, seemed to make everything military doctrine had known obsolete. By 1940, with Nazi dominance extending from the English Channel to the Bug River, there was a real question in the Allied general staffs. Could Germany be stopped? The answer came on July 10, 1940, over the skies of southern England. Hitler sent the Luftwaffe against Great Britain. It was Operation Sea Lion, the prelude to an amphibious invasion. If the British Royal Air Force, the RAF, could be destroyed, the English beaches would be left defenseless. The operation lasted 113 days. In the end, the Luftwaffe had lost 1,900 aircraft, at a loss rate its production lines could not sustain. Hermann Göring cancelled the Battle of Britain and began accumulating forces for something different. It was Hitler's first major defeat in World War II. For Roosevelt, the lesson was clear. Air power was the new orthodoxy of modern warfare. He ordered mass production of bombers at the Willow Run plants in Michigan. The result was 8,500 bombers produced at that complex alone. In total, more than 127,000 bombers were manufactured during the war. 13,600 of them were transported to air bases in Great Britain. The main instrument of this effort was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, an extraordinary aircraft for its time. 13.50 caliber machine guns strategically distributed to create what engineers called a bubble of fire. Coverage from the front, the flanks, the underside, the top and the tail. American doctrine held that a formation of B-17S could defend itself alone, without fighter escort, penetrate deep into enemy territory in broad daylight, and destroy industrial targets with precision. It was the theory of precision bombing, and the strategists of the 8th Air Force believed in it with a conviction bordering on faith. On August 17, 1943, they put that conviction to the test. The double mission against Schweinfurt and Regensburg had a clear objective: destroy the heart of German aircraft production. 2 squadrons of B-17 would attack simultaneously to divide the defenses. Colonel Curtis LeMay commanded the Regensburg group, Brigadier General Robert Williams, the Schweinfurt one. The plan was coordinated to the second. If the 2 groups arrived at the same time, the German fighters would not have time to refuel between one interception and the next. But that day there was thick fog over England. LeMay took off with his group at the scheduled time. Williams waited. When his bombers finally rose, the German fighters had already shot down Regensburg's men and had time to land, refuel, and return to the air. The Schweinfurt B-17 entered the inferno alone. 60 bombers were destroyed, double the losses ever suffered in a single attack. The problem was evident from space, with brutal clarity. The Allied escort fighters had limited range. They could accompany the bombers only for part of the journey. After that, the B-17S flew alone over Germany and the Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109 fighters were waiting for them. The solution came in the form of an American fighter, the P-51 Mustang. The P-51 was extraordinary in several technical respects. Its Merlin engine, designed by Rolls-Royce and produced in the United States by Packard, gave it speed and maneuverability superior to almost any German fighter of the time. But what changed the war was its operational range. With supplementary fuel tanks, the P-51 could accompany the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. For the first time, the 8th Air Force could send B-17 formations into the heart of Germany, with fighter escort for the entire journey. When the Luftwaffe was swept from the skies, the Allies attacked what hurt the German war economy the most: fuel. The synthetic oil refineries, the hydrogenation plants, the fuel depots. Germany did not have access to natural petroleum in quantities sufficient to sustain a mechanized war. Its 20 million barrels of strategic reserves were depleted with every offensive. To close that gap, German engineers had developed synthesis processes from coal and natural gas. It was an expensive and technically complex solution, but it worked, until it began to be bombed. When synthetic fuel production fell, German tanks began to stop for lack of diesel. Luftwaffe planes could not fly. Trains did not reach the fronts. The greatest war machine Europe had known began to die of energy starvation. Operation Barbarossa and the Hell of the Eastern Front, June 22, 1941. More than 4 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border along a front of 2,900 kilometers. It was the largest military operation in human history up to that moment. More than 3,000 aircraft, 3,500 tanks, and 750,000 tons of supplies crossed with them. Hitler had two reasons for attacking the Soviet Union, and both were real. The first was ideological. The USSR was, in his mind, the bastion of communism and of Judaism. Its destruction was an existential objective for Nazism. The second was pragmatic. The Lebensraum, the great economic space that Nazi doctrine needed to sustain its dominance, oil from the Caucasus, wheat from Ukraine, manganese from Georgia, steel from the Urals. With those raw materials under German control, the Reich could resist any Anglo-Saxon blockade indefinitely. Without them, the war would be a race against exhaustion. Operation Barbarossa began with an operational mastery that the Soviets simply could not match. The German army groups, North, Center, and South, advanced in pincer movements that encircled entire armies. In the first weeks, the Wehrmacht captured or destroyed more than 10,000 Soviet tanks and 390,000 aircraft. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko lost control of entire fronts within days. But behind the frontline troops came something different from regular soldiers. The Einsatzgruppen, the SS Special Operations Groups, followed each advance with a specific mission: identify and murder Communist Party officials, political commissars, and the Jews of the occupied areas. At Babi Yar, near Kiev, in 2 days in September 1941, 33,771 people were shot. The massacre of 1 million Soviets in the first months of Operation Barbarossa was, in the words of historians who studied Nuremberg, the testing ground of the Holocaust. By the winter of 1941, the German advance had reached the edge of victory. Leningrad was under siege. The panzer divisions of Army Group Center were at the gates of Moscow. German soldiers could see the glint of sunlight reflected off the domes of the Kremlin through their binoculars. And then winter came. The German troops were not equipped for it. Hitler had anticipated the campaign would end before September. The soldiers did not have adequate winter clothing. Tank engines froze at temperatures of 40 degrees below zero. Rifle lubricants solidified, and the Red Army, which had been retreating for months, received reinforcements from Siberia. Troops trained for the cold and launched a counteroffensive that pushed the Wehrmacht back to within a few kilometers of the capital. Hitler took a moment and decided his next objective. It would not be Moscow. It would be Stalingrad. Stalingrad, the point of no return. Stalingrad was important for multiple reasons. It was the industrial center of southern Russia. It bore Stalin's name, which meant its fall would carry devastating symbolic weight. It controlled river access to the Volga, the logistical artery connecting the north with the Caucasus, and above all, its capture would open the way to the Caucasus oil fields that the Wehrmacht desperately needed. For Joseph Stalin, losing the city was unthinkable. Order number 227, known among Soviet soldiers as "Not One Step Back," was issued in August 1942. Its content was simple and brutal. Any commander who ordered a retreat without express authorization would be shot. Any soldier who abandoned his position would be considered a traitor. The barrier units, formed by NKVD troops, were stationed behind Soviet lines with orders to shoot their own men. The battle began on August 23, 1942, when the Luftwaffe dropped 1,000 tons of bombs on the city. Within 48 hours, Stalingrad had been turned into a labyrinth of ruins. And it was in that labyrinth that the German army found its grave. The Soviet tactic developed by General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army, was called hugging the enemy. Keep Soviet positions so close to the German ones that the Luftwaffe could not bomb without killing its own men. Fight for every floor of every building, for every staircase, for every room. Soldiers on both sides slept meters apart from one another, separated by a wall or a pile of rubble. The casualties were incomprehensible. In the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory complex, German companies that went in with 100 men came out the next day with 20. The Soviets received reinforcements crossing the Volga under German fire, many of them dying in the water before reaching the western shore. German witness Joachim Weider, a staff officer of the 6th Army, wrote after the war that at Stalingrad the distinction between the brave and the cowardly lost all meaning. What existed was resistance or death. In November 1942, while the 6th Army of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus was locked into every street of the destroyed city, the Soviet High Command executed Operation Uranus. Two army groups, that of the Southwestern Front to the north and that of the Steppe Front to the south, simultaneously launched offensives against the flanks of the German salient. The flanks were defended by Romanian and Hungarian troops who lacked the anti-tank equipment needed to withstand the Soviet armored push. Within 72 hours, 330,000 German soldiers were surrounded. Goering promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the 6th Army by air. It needed 600 tons daily to sustain the operation. On the best days of the aerial supply campaign, 140 arrived. On the worst, 16. Paulus's men began to die of hunger and cold. Temperatures dropped to 45 degrees below zero. Field hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded who could not be evacuated. Soldiers chewed the leather of their belts. Lieutenant Heinz Schröter, one of the survivors who wrote about the experience, recalled seeing his comrades die standing in the frozen trenches, unable to move enough to warm their bodies. On January 31st, 1943, Friedrich Paulus, newly promoted to Field Marshal, surrendered. He was the first German Field Marshal ever taken prisoner in the entire history of the Prussian army. 2 million people had died in the battle. The 6th Army, which had entered Stalingrad with 330,000 men, left 250,000 of them behind in the Russian cold. The tide had turned. The German prisoners were forced to march through the streets of Moscow. For the Soviet population, the image of those men in rags, filthy, with frozen faces, was tangible proof of something Stalin's propaganda had said, but that no one was certain to believe, that the German army was not invincible. Kursk, the last blow. Hitler needed to regain the initiative. The defeat at Stalingrad had been a blow to the myth of Nazi invincibility, but the German war machine was still formidable. In the spring of 1943, the Eastern Front showed a salient, a protrusion of Soviet territory that pushed into the German lines around the city of Kursk. If the Wehrmacht could isolate that salient with a pincer movement, it would trap the Soviet armies occupying it and regain the strategic initiative. Operation Citadel was the plan. Two army groups would attack from the north and south of the salient simultaneously, closing it like a trap. But the Soviets knew what was coming. The Allied intelligence network, which included agents deeply embedded within the German General Staff itself, had leaked the details of the operation months before. With that information, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky designed the largest defensive network the war had seen up to that point. 3 staggered lines of defense, each deeper than the last, more than 400,000 mines. Artillery zones pre-calculated so that every meter of the German advance would be covered by cannon fire. 8 Soviet armies waited inside and behind the salient. Seen from space, the scale of the Soviet preparation was monumental. More than 80 kilometers of defense in depth. The comparison with the French Maginot Line is inevitable. Unlike that one, the Soviet defense at Kursk was not designed to stop the enemy at a fixed line, but to absorb it, wear it down, and then destroy it with a counter-offensive. On July 5, 1943, the largest tank battle in history began. More than 2,000 tanks from both sides clashed on the southern front of the salient. The SS had their Tiger I, with its 88mm cannon capable of destroying any Allied tank at distances the Soviets could barely imagine. The Soviets responded with the T-34, more numerous, more reliable in the Russian mud, and constantly improving. At Prokhorovka on July 12th, the armored forces collided in a battle that survivors described as hell made of steel. Flamethrowers, ammunition explosions, burning tanks that lit up the steppe by day. Pilots and drivers who died inside their machines before they could get out. After 11 days, the German offensive collapsed at a third of its objective. Operation Citadel had failed. Hitler would never again launch a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. From Kursk onward, Germany would fight defensively in the east while trying to contain the Allies in the west. It was exactly the two-front war that the German General Staff had feared since 1939. North Africa, the American baptism of fire. Before a single American soldier set foot on French soil, Roosevelt made another decision his generals did not immediately understand: send troops to North Africa. North Africa was, for Great Britain, much more than a desert. It was the hinge of the empire. Controlling Egypt meant controlling the Suez Canal, which connected the metropole with India, Australia, South Africa. An Axis victory on that front would open the eastern Mediterranean and the oil fields of the Middle East to Nazi Germany. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been pushing the British back for more than 2 years. With the Africa Corps, he had exploited speed and surprise in a way British commanders could not anticipate. But in October 1942 at El Alamein, General Bernard Montgomery stopped Rommel's advance. And with that check, Churchill saw the opportunity to involve the United States in a theater where American troops could gain experience fighting secondary German units before facing the Wehrmacht in France. Roosevelt's decision to send forces to North Africa was, in retrospect, perhaps the most brilliant of the entire war. It gave the American army, which went from 190,000 men in 1940 to 16 million during the war, a place to learn to fight before mistakes cost victories in decisive theaters. On November 8, 1942, Operation Torch put 73,000 Allied soldiers on the beaches of North Africa. And almost everything immediately went wrong. The landing craft, the first type of amphibious vessels of the war, had no front ramps. Soldiers had to jump over the sides into the water. Several vessels ran aground on sandbanks. When they were finally freed, the electronics failed. Luckily for the Americans, they were facing Vichy France's troops who fought without enthusiasm. Had they been German or Japanese, the landing would have been a complete disaster. After consolidating the beachheads, US forces headed toward Tunisia and their first real encounter with the German war machine. General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding the American Second Corps, was certain his men, well equipped and backed by a logistics chain Rommel would have envied, would perform well. On February 14, 1943, Rommel showed them how wrong they were. At the Kasserine Pass, the German panzer divisions executed a double envelopment maneuver with a precision American units could not counter. The German 88mm anti-tank gun, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon and repurposed to destroy armor, was devastating at distances American tanks could not even reach with their own armament. American soldiers with no combat experience, who had never seen what a battle really looked like, panicked. Frank Curry, who was there and who would survive to receive the Medal of Honor in another theater, recalled decades later arriving at the Kasserine Pass and being able to smell the burned flesh of the crews of destroyed tanks. The smell, he said, would not go away. American forces suffered 6,500 casualties. It was an unambiguous defeat, but it was the best thing that could have happened to the American army. The changes came immediately. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who before the war had never fired a weapon in combat, learned the lessons Kasserine taught and applied them systematically. General George S. Patton replaced Fredendall at the head of the Second Corps. Tactical procedures were rewritten. The doctrine of coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was reformed from scratch. By May 1943, Tunisia had fallen. 250,000 Axis soldiers, German and Italian, surrendered in North Africa. It was the second largest surrender of the war up to that point. The American army had learned to fight. Sicily fell in August. Italy was invaded in September. The road to Normandy was paved with the lessons of the desert. Midway, the balance that changed hands. While the European front stabilized and North Africa fell under Allied control, the Pacific was living its own war of survival. In April 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25s taking off from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet to bomb Tokyo. The material damage was minimal, but the psychological impact on Japanese military leadership was enormous. The Imperial Palace, the residence of Emperor Hirohito, had been at the mercy of enemy aircraft. For the generals who had promised its inviolability, the shame was unbearable. The response was to extend the Japanese defensive perimeter to the Midway Islands in the Central Pacific. By controlling Midway, the Imperial Navy could force the American Pacific Fleet to come out and fight on Japanese terms, far from the repair and supply bases of Hawaii. What Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto did not know was that the Americans already knew what was coming. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptologists from the Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit, working with punch-card technology and mathematical analysis in the basement of the naval headquarters at Pearl Harbor, had broken JN-25, the Japanese naval code. They knew Yamamoto would attack Midway. They knew when. They knew the approximate composition of the approaching naval force. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned 4 aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, Yorktown, Hornet, and a 4th in reserve, 400 kilometers from Midway, out of range of Japanese radar. On June 4, 1942, at 4 in the morning, the first Japanese wave took off from Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carriers to bomb the island. What followed was a chain of decisions and coincidences that historians have spent 80 years studying. When a Japanese reconnaissance plane finally detected the American fleet, Nagumo was in the process of rearming his aircraft, replacing land bombs with naval torpedoes to attack the carriers. But the process was long, and while the decks of the 4 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, were crowded with planes, fuel, and ammunition, the American bombers arrived. The first American attacks, 41 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, arrived without fighter escort. The Japanese Zeros destroyed them methodically. 35 of the 41 shot down without a single bomb reaching the Japanese fleet. For the American pilots in those planes, it was a massacre. For history, it was the sacrifice that drew the Japanese Zeros down to sea level. And then the dive bombers arrived. The 3 squadrons of SBD Dauntless that found the Japanese fleet with decks full and the Zeros out of position had only minutes to act. In less than 6 minutes, the Akagi, The Kaga and the Soryu were in flames. The Hiryu survived long enough to launch its own attacks and severely damage the Yorktown, but it was sunk that same afternoon. 4 Japanese fleet carriers at the bottom of the Pacific, 250 elite pilots, the irreplaceable core of Imperial Naval Aviation, dead. Yamamoto, with the largest fleet Japan had ever assembled, withdrew without attempting a surface battle. The subsequent arithmetic was relentless. Japan had 1 carrier under construction when it lost the 4. The United States had 7. The gap would grow progressively larger. From midway on, the war in the Pacific would be, for Japan, a progressive defense. The island advance, the war unlike any other. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur designed the strategy along 2 axes. Nimitz through the Central Pacific, with the Marines as the shock force. MacArthur through the Southwestern Pacific with the Army, both converging on Japan through different island chains, depriving the empire of the possibility of concentrating its defenses at a single point. The strategy was called island hopping, and every island had its price. In June 1944, while the Allies were landing in Normandy, Admiral Raymond Spruance's fleet, the largest the United States had assembled in the Pacific up to that point, approached the Mariana Islands. Saipan was the main objective. Its airfields, once captured, would put the B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito ordered that Saipan be defended at all costs. The 32,000 Japanese soldiers stationed on the island took that literally. On June 15, 1944, 80,000 American Marines began landing under intense fire. By the end of the first day, 3,400 Marines were dead or wounded. Japanese resistance in the caves, the bunkers, the jungles was fanatical. The Americans had to throw barrels of burning gasoline into the cave entrances because the defenders would not come out. And while the Battle of Saipan was being fought on land, 55 Japanese warships approached from the west to try to destroy the invasion force. It was the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Over 8 hours on June 19, 1944, 429 Japanese aircraft were shot down against 29 American, a ratio of 15 to 1. The American pilots, flying the new F-6F Hellcat fighter, armored, fast, and able to absorb hits that would have downed any Zero, were facing Japanese pilots who had been in the air for months, but who had flown with scarce fuel due to the lack of oil, and whose training was inferior to what Japan had been able to provide before the war. The Americans called the battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. When Saipan fell, something happened that American observers were not prepared to see. 8,000 Japanese civilians, men, women, and children, threw themselves off the cliffs into the sea. Mothers threw their babies before jumping themselves. Wounded soldiers set off grenades on themselves. The indoctrination about American cruelty, which had been part of Japanese civilian education for years, had created something without precedent in modern warfare, a population that preferred death to surrender. It was a sign of what awaited further ahead. General Limay and the Night of Black Snow. In January 1945, Air Force General Curtis LeMay arrived at the conquered Mariana bases with a philosophy of war that few people in the Allied chain of command would have articulated so directly. LeMay believed there should be no restraint whatsoever in the destruction of enemy war power. That massive strategic bombing with no restrictions on civilian targets was the most effective and, paradoxically, the fastest way to end the war with the lowest total number of casualties on both sides. The theory had an internal logic. Its practical consequences were another matter. Japan was a country built of wood. Its industrial cities were dense concentrations of factories, home workshops, and wood-framed dwellings clustered at minimal distances. When LeMay asked to have his bombers loaded not with high-explosive bombs, but with M69 incendiary bombs, the result, he calculated, was devastating. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, 329 B-29 super fortresses flew at low altitude over Tokyo, between 500 and 1,500 meters, much lower than any previous strategic bombing mission. Each plane carried between 6 and 8 tons of M69 incendiary bombs. The total explosives dropped was nearly 2,000 tons. The city burned. The Japanese called that night the Night of Black Snow for the charred debris that rained down for hours over the neighborhoods that were not yet in flames. The lead bomber, coordinating the mission from his plane, described being able to see the fires from 240 kilometers away. The asphalt melted in the streets. The water canals boiled. People tried to take refuge in the rivers and burned anyway, because the surface of the water was covered in burning napalm. The Japanese doctors who worked in the ruins the next day wrote that they could not tell whether the objects floating in the canals were human bodies or charred logs. 41 square kilometers of Tokyo were leveled. 90,000 civilians died in a single night. 1,300,000 people lost their homes. Over the following 10 days, LeMay repeated the operation over Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Kawasaki. Japan did not have enough fighter planes, nor enough fuel to fly the ones it had, to defend its cities against formations of 200 or 300 B-29s flying in the dark. The American general showed no visible doubt. His reasoning was utilitarian and cold. Every factory destroyed was one less plane. Every dead worker was one less shell. The war would end sooner. It was possible he was right about the arithmetic. History offers no alternative version to compare it against. D-Day, the greatest gamble in history. In November 1943, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill met in Tehran to coordinate the operation that would decide the fate of the war in Europe. Stalin demanded what he had demanded since 1941, a second front. Every month that the Americans and British delayed landing in Western Europe was one more month of Soviet blood spilled. He had already lost more than 9 million soldiers. His cities were in ruins. His economy, though sustained by American lend-lease, was at its limit. Churchill knew what the Allies could and could not do. The defeats at Dunkirk, Norway, and Greece had taught how formidable the Wehrmacht was in its defensive positions. The attempted landing at Dieppe in August 1942, a test operation with mainly 6,000 Canadian soldiers, had ended in catastrophe. 3,500 casualties in less than 9 hours. Hitler's Atlantic Wall was real. 2,600 kilometers of reinforced coastline, with machine gun bunkers, underwater minefields, obstacles designed to tear open the hulls of landing craft, 155mm guns with range enough to destroy ships before they reached the beach. The German generals who had built it were convinced that any attempt at a frontal assault would be repelled with devastating losses. For D-Day to succeed, 4 distinct conditions had to be met simultaneously. First, air supremacy. The Allies had to destroy enough Luftwaffe aircraft before the landing to prevent German bombers from attacking the invasion fleet or reinforcing coastal positions. Second, strategic surprise. If Hitler knew where and when the invasion would arrive, he could concentrate his armored reserves in Normandy. Without surprise, the landing would fail. Third, coordination with the Eastern Front. A large simultaneous Soviet offensive would prevent Germany from moving divisions from the east. Fourth, sustained logistics. Getting the soldiers to the beach was only the beginning. They had to be kept supplied for weeks while advancing inland without functioning ports. The solution to the second problem was Operation Fortitude. To this day, possibly the greatest deception plan of modern warfare. A phantom army was created in southeastern England, facing the coast of Calais. 11 divisions that did not exist. Inflatable rubber tanks, wooden airstrips, canvas hangars. Radio signals transmitting communications traffic designed to be intercepted by German intelligence. At the head of this fictitious army, a name, General George S. Patton, the commander the Germans respected most, and whom, logically, they expected to see leading the main assault. The result was that the German High Command, with Army Group Pas de Calais awaiting a landing that would never come, kept its main armoured reserves away from Normandy even after the real landing had begun. Hitler, convinced that D-Day in Normandy was a decoy, took critical hours to authorize the movement of the panzer divisions toward the real front. Those hours cost Germany the war in the West. The logistical planning for D-Day was in the hands of Royal Navy Commodore Sir Bertrand Ramsay. Nearly 7,000 vessels would be loaded with men and supplies and secretly led to the assembly points. They would sail through channels swept of mines across the English Channel toward 5 designated beaches with code names Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. A German artillery emplacement on the cliff of Point du Hoc, capable of raking all the landing beaches, would be attacked by US Army Rangers scaling the cliff directly under fire. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, set the date for June 5, 1944. Bad weather forced him to delay 24 hours. When the weather window opened on June 6th, Eisenhower launched the operation and wrote a note in his pocket accepting personal responsibility for the failure in case it failed. At 6:30 in the morning, the first soldiers touched the Normandy beaches. At Omaha, the most exposed beach and the one with the most concentrated German defenses, the landing skirted disaster. 2 American infantry divisions, the 1st and the 29th, arrived in chaotic conditions. Many soldiers drowned before reaching shore, dragged to the bottom by their equipment as the landing craft ramps opened in deep water. Those who reached the sand found that the prior aerial and naval bombardment had failed. The German bunkers were intact, their machine guns aimed straight at the water. Charles Balcom, one of the first to reach Omaha Beach, recalled entering the water with it reaching his stomach and thinking he was going to die. There were bodies of Americans floating around him. He ran to the sand and did not look back. In 15 hours of combat, the Allies suffered 10,000 casualties. But as night fell on June 6th, the 5 beachheads were secured. For Hitler, it was a nightmare made real. For the rest of the world, it was the beginning of the end. After D-Day, the advance that does not stop. Reaching the beach was only the first problem, the second was holding it, and the third was advancing. The Mulberry artificial harbours, 2 enormous prefabricated structures towed from Great Britain and assembled off the beaches of Utah and Arromanches, solved the problem of immediate supply. In the first 10 months of operation, they received 2.5 million men, 4 million tons of supplies, and 500,000 vehicles. A storm destroyed one of the 2 artificial harbours shortly after its installation, but the one that survived proved the idea worked. To push fuel inland, engineers launched Operation Pluto, 112 kilometers of underwater pipelines pumping nearly 4 million litres of fuel per day from Great Britain to France. The fuel that had previously arrived by ship under constant threat from the U-boot now flowed continuously along the bottom of the channel. The advance through France was slower than initially calculated. The Norman hedgerows, the bocage, those mazes of earthen walls covered in dense vegetation that divided the French countryside into cells where tanks could not maneuver, gave the German defenders an advantage for weeks. But when the advance broke through, it broke through for good. On August 19, 1944, Paris was liberated. The Free French forces under the command of General Philippe Leclerc entered the capital as the last German soldiers retreated. General Charles de Gaulle, who had spent 4 years in London exile, marched down the Champs-Élysées before a crowd too large for the sidewalks. After Paris came Rouen, then Verdun, then Antwerp, then Brussels. By September 1944, the Allies had reached the Siegfried Line, the defensive system marking the border of Germany itself. Hitler, in his bunker beneath Berlin, launched one last desperate counterattack. The Battle of the Bulge, begun on December 16, 1944, was the largest German offensive in the West since 1940. 28 divisions, including 9 panzer, broke through the Allied front in the snowy hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. In the first week, the American forces of General Courtney Hodges fell back dozens of kilometers. The cold was 15 degrees below zero. The fog prevented air support. The elite units of the 101st Airborne Division were surrounded at Bastogne, without supplies or reinforcements. But the offensive failed for the same reasons as all the previous ones: lack of fuel. The Tiger and Panther panzers, whose consumption per kilometer was brutal, stopped when their tanks ran empty. As luck would have it, at several points along the German advance, the tanks stood stranded meters from Allied fuel depots they did not have time to capture before reinforcements arrived. When the fog lifted in January 1945, the Allied Air Force destroyed what remained of the offensive from the air. The Bulge was Hitler's last gamble. In exhausting it, he guaranteed that no armoured reserve remained to defend German territory itself. The conquest of the Third Reich by Americans from the west and Soviets from the east was, from January 1945 onward, only a matter of time. Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the price of every metre. While Europe drew closer to its resolution, the Pacific was living through its bloodiest battles. On February 19, 1945, 60,000 American Marines attacked Iwo Jima, a volcanic island of 20 square kilometers with extraordinary strategic value. Its airfields could serve as an emergency base for the B-29s bombing Japan and as a staging point for long-range escort fighters. The 22,000 Japanese soldiers stationed on Iwo Jima, under the command of General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had transformed the island into a network of interconnected tunnels, bunkers, and firing positions. They had explicit orders: die in position. Kill as many Americans as possible. Do not retreat. Do not surrender. Kuribayashi's logic was consistent with Japanese strategy of that period. If every island cost enough American casualties, perhaps Washington would conclude that invading the Japanese archipelago was not worth the price. Perhaps it would accept a negotiated peace. Perhaps the emperor could keep the throne. For 36 days, the Battle of Iwo Jima was a fight measured in centimeters. The Marines used flamethrowers to burn out the caves, demolition charges to collapse the tunnels. At some points, the distance between American and Japanese positions was so small that soldiers threw hand grenades at each other from 10 meters away. By the end of the battle, Japan had suffered 20,000 casualties. The United States, 23,000. It was the first time in the entire Pacific War that American casualties exceeded the enemy's. The famous photograph by Joe Rosenthal, the Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi on February 23rd, became the icon of the American war effort. What the photograph did not show was that 3 of the 6 men raising the flag died before the battle ended. Okinawa was worse. On April 1, 1945, an invasion force of 182,000 American soldiers landed on the largest island of the Ryukyu chain. The scale of the operation was comparable to D-Day, 1,200 warships supporting 3 amphibious attack forces. The first soldiers reached the beaches without meeting resistance. The 97,000 Japanese defenders under the command of General Mitsuru Ushijima had deliberately withdrawn into the interior of the island toward a system of ridges, caves, and artillery positions prepared over months. They would let the Americans land. Then they would attack them once ashore, far from naval support, on terrain the defenders knew centimeter by centimeter. In the air, over the invasion fleet, the kamikaze pilots of Operation Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, launched continuous attacks. The kamikaze was a weapon designed for the 21st century of suicide warfare. A plane turned into a missile, piloted by a man who arrived at the theater of combat knowing he would not return. The impact of a Zero loaded with explosives against the deck of a destroyer was the equivalent of a precision bomb that never missed. 18% of kamikaze attacks hit their targets. 404 American ships were damaged or destroyed. The Battle of Okinawa lasted 82 days. 100,000 Japanese soldiers and 150,000 Okinawan civilians died. The United States suffered 76,000 casualties, almost a third of the entire invasion force. The number of civilian casualties in Okinawa, which had had a population of 450,000 people before the battle, was proportionally greater than in any other battle of World War II, including Hiroshima. The United States War Department calculated what invading the main islands of Japan would mean. The plan, Operation Downfall, projected 10 million Japanese casualties and between 1,700,000 and 4 million American casualties. The calculations varied, depending on the model used, but all agreed on a range that made the mind recoil. Another solution had to be found. The Manhattan Project and the End of the Previous World. In December 1938, two German scientists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, bombarded uranium nuclei with neutrons in their Berlin laboratory and observed that the nuclei split in two, releasing tremendous energy. Nuclear fission was possible. The news reached Albert Einstein through physicist Lise Meitner, who had fled Germany after the Nuremberg Laws. Einstein, who would never work directly on the Manhattan Project but whose letter to President Roosevelt was decisive, wrote in August 1939 that the new research on uranium fission could lead to the construction of bombs of a new and extremely powerful type. Roosevelt received the letter and took it seriously. When, in 1942, intelligence reports confirmed that Germany had an active nuclear program under the direction of physicist Werner Heisenberg, the decision to accelerate the American effort became inevitable. The Manhattan Project, under the command of General Leslie Groves and the scientific direction of Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, mobilized 600,000 people at facilities spread across the country. The main centers were Oak Ridge in Tennessee, where uranium was enriched through gaseous diffusion, Hanford in Washington, where plutonium was produced in nuclear reactors, and Los Alamos in New Mexico, where the brightest physicists of the Western world designed the weapon. The total cost of the Manhattan Project was $2 billion. In 2024, money around $32 billion. It was the most expensive engineering project in history up to that point, secretly financed within the defense budget, unknown to almost all members of Congress and to Vice President Harry Truman, who discovered it when he became president after Roosevelt's death in April 1945. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the first atomic bomb in history detonated in the Trinity test. The explosion was equivalent to 21 kilotons of TNT. The fireball rose to 12 kilometers in height. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the flash, recalled a line from the sacred Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." Two designs had been developed in parallel. Little Boy was a uranium bomb, relatively simple in operation, but requiring massive quantities of enriched uranium, an extraordinarily difficult material to produce. Fat Man was a plutonium bomb, technologically more complex, requiring an implosion detonation system designed to compress the plutonium core in a perfectly spherical manner within a fraction of a second. President Truman faced an unprecedented decision. The considerations were multiple: ending the war before an invasion that would cost millions of lives on both sides, but also something that later declassified documents confirm: concern over Soviet expansion in Asia. If the USSR, which Roosevelt and Truman had invited to enter the war against Japan, occupied Manchuria and eventually part of the Japanese archipelago, the post-war power map in the Pacific would be radically different. A rapid Japanese capitulation, before the Soviets could advance too far, was strategically convenient for Washington. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning local time, the B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, arrived over Hiroshima at 9,000 meters of altitude. The Little Boy bomb, loaded with 60 kilograms of uranium-235, was released. 43 seconds later, the world changed forever. The explosion released the equivalent of 15 kilotons of TNT. A fireball 1,300 meters in diameter formed within tenths of a second. The pressure wave destroyed every building within a radius of 1.5 kilometers. Secondary fires covered 7 kilometers in every direction. 60,000 people died in the instant of the detonation. Another 100,000 died in the following days, weeks and months from burns, injuries and radiation. On August 9th, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. 80,000 additional deaths. In Japan, there was disbelief in the first hours. The details of the weapon were not known. Some generals of the General Staff argued that the Americans could not have many more bombs of that type and that the war should continue. The Minister of War, General Korichika Anami, maintained to the end that resistance was the only honorable path. It was Emperor Hirohito who intervened directly and unprecedentedly in the Japanese military decision-making process. On August 15, 1945, in a recorded radio message, his voice, which most Japanese had never heard in their lives, announced that Japan accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Imperial Government of Japan signed the formal surrender. World War II ended. The balance sheet from space. Who won and what was lost? 78 million people dead. The number is so large that the human brain processes it as abstraction. Not as 78 million individual lives, each with a name and a place of origin and a family that waited, but as a figure on a page. From space, the question of who won World War II has two distinct answers. If the question is who paid the highest price in blood, the answer is not the United States. It is the Soviet Union. The Red Army lost 8,600,000 soldiers in combat. Soviet civilian casualties, including those who died of hunger, those massacred by the Einsatzgruppen, those who died in the sieges of Leningrad and Stalingrad, the deportees who died in the camps, add up to another 16.5 million. In total, more than 25 million Soviet citizens. 1 out of every 8 people living in the USSR in 1941 died before 1945. The United States lost 405,399 soldiers, an enormous number, a number that destroyed families and communities across the country. But compared to the Soviet figure, it was different by an order of magnitude. However, if the question is who came out of the war in the most advantageous position, the answer changes completely. The United States entered World War II as the 17th military power in the world. It emerged from it as the first, with no visible rival. Its military bases abroad went from 14 to more than 30,000 around the world. Its gross national product doubled during the war, while the economies of Europe and Asia lay in ruins. It became the world's largest lender, the world's largest manufacturer, holder of 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. It dominated the founding of the United Nations organization. It designed the Bretton Woods system that organized the post-war international economy. And it had the bomb. That asymmetry between who paid the highest price and who received the greatest benefits would be the root of tensions that lasted the rest of the 20th century. Great Britain had survived, but at a cost that was not immediately visible to it. The destroyers for bases deal of 1940, which had seemed the only possible way out, had begun the dismantling of the imperial trade preference system. The bases ceded in exchange for the destroyers marked the beginning of a structural dependency on Washington that was never fully reversed. In the following decades, India, Pakistan, Burma, Ceylon, Ghana, and dozens of other territories achieved independence. The British Empire, which had dominated a quarter of the Earth's surface, dissolved within a generation. France recovered its independence, but not its stature. The humiliation of 1940, the collaboration of the Vichy government, the dependence on foreign powers for its own liberation, left deep scars on French national identity that de Gaulle would spend decades trying to suture. Germany was left divided. The implicit agreement of Yalta and Potsdam created two Germanys separated by a border that did not exist on any map before 1945. The western half would eventually join the American bloc. The eastern would remain under the Soviet orbit. Japan was occupied and reconstituted. The constitution that Japan adopted in 1947, under the supervision of General MacArthur, prohibited it from having offensive armed forces. The country that had attacked Pearl Harbor would become, within decades, one of Washington's closest allies. And the Soviet Union, which had paid the highest price, received what Stalin had demanded since 1943, a cordon of satellite states in Eastern Europe acting as a buffer against any future Western threat. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. The empire that was not called an empire, but that functioned as one. Two superpowers, two systems, a planet split in two by a war that had lasted 6 years. That tension, the tension between the only two powers that emerged from World War II with the capacity to project power on a global scale, would define the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War was not the accident of the post-war period. It was its logical consequence, seen from space, inevitable from the moment Roosevelt decided to save Great Britain, keep the Soviet Union alive with loans and trucks, and launch his own country into the role of global power it would never again abandon. What space reveals that the Earth does not show? There is something that can only be seen from far away. From the level of the trench, every battle seems like an isolated event. A beach in Normandy, a building in Stalingrad, an atoll in the Pacific. The soldiers who fought in those places rarely knew the complete picture. The sergeant who pushed his men across Omaha Beach did not know that simultaneously a fleet of Japanese carriers was being destroyed thousands of kilometers to the east. The Soviet pilot who flew over the Don during Operation Uranus did not know that at that very moment, Allied cryptologists were breaking Dönitz's Enigma code in the Atlantic. Seen from above, the coherence is striking. Oil connects everything. The Japanese decision to attack Pearl Harbor was the direct result of the 1941 American oil embargo. Operation Barbarossa had as its final objective the oil fields of the Caucasus. Germany's defeat was decisively accelerated when Allied bombing destroyed its capacity to produce synthetic fuel. The aircraft carriers that dominated the Pacific needed massive quantities of fuel that Japan could not supply. The industrial factor connects everything else. Modern war was not won by the bravest soldier. It was won by the industrial system that could produce more planes, more tanks, more ships, more ammunition, more fuel than its enemy, and do so quickly enough to replace losses. The United States produced 300,000 aircraft. Germany produced 112,000. Japan, 65,000. The arithmetic of industrial production was the arithmetic of victory, and the technological factor ties the threads together. The magnetron the British shared with the Americans in 1940 changed the Battle of the Atlantic. Breaking the Enigma code saved millions of tons of supplies. The decrypted JN-25 code made Midway possible. The P-51 Mustang opened the skies over Germany. The Manhattan Project ended the war without an invasion of Japan. Each of those technological innovations crossed borders and oceans. Allied collaboration was, in itself, a strategic advantage the Axis could never replicate. Germany, Japan, and Italy never shared technology or coordinated global strategy the way Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union did. The Axis won individual battles with a tactical brilliance their enemies took time to match. But it lost the war of the system. The world that remained. On September 2nd, 1945, at 9:02 in the morning, Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri. World War II was history, but its consequences were not. The 78 million dead had left behind a transformed world. The European empires that had dominated the planet for centuries were in the process of dissolving. Two superpowers with incompatible visions of world order faced each other with nuclear arsenals that both knew could not be used without destroying each other. Atomic bomb technology, born from the desperate race to outdo the enemy, had inaugurated an era in which the potential scale of destruction exceeded any conceivable political objective. General Curtis LeMay, who had reduced 180 square kilometers of Japanese cities to ashes, said after the war that if the United States had lost, he would have been tried as a war criminal. The distinction between victors and criminals, he implied, was the result of the battle. Robert Oppenheimer, who had overseen the building of the bomb, was subjected to a security investigation in 1954 and stripped of his access credentials to the American nuclear program, in part because he had expressed moral doubts about the weapon he had created. Eisenhower became president. Patton died in a car accident in December 1945. Nimitz was appointed Chief of Naval Operations. MacArthur oversaw the occupation and reconstruction of Japan, and the soldiers who had fought, those who had crossed Omaha Beach, and those who had climbed the cliff at Suribachi, and those who had survived the siege of Stalingrad, went home. Many never spoke of what they had seen. Some could never stop seeing it. From space, World War II was the most brutal demonstration in the history of human civilization that great forces, industry, technology, geopolitics, natural resources determine the outcome of conflicts with a coldness that leaves little room for individual heroism. But it also showed that at critical moments, a decision made by one person, a community of scientists sharing their secrets, an admiral who bets his carriers in the right place, a cryptologist who breaks the code at just the right moment, can alter the trajectory of those great forces. History is not deterministic until it ends, and that is what is learned by looking from above.